Hello, good morning, and welcome to China Now with me, Makiza Latifa. This is your gateway to understanding today's China. Let's begin with China Currents, where Lisa takes us through the week's top stories on trends shaping China right now. Topics for today includes China's announcement of a new round of sanctions against 10 U.S. arms companies. Also coming up is some exciting news about civil aviation, as reports indicate that China's airliner C919 aircraft will commence operation in Southeast Asia by 2026. And then also, China has achieved a major milestone in satellite communications. This breakthrough will allow a satellite to transmit 10 full-length movies to Earth by every second. Exciting, right? If you think it is, then please stay tuned for an insightful journey into the heart of one of the world's most dynamic nations. Let's get started.
China Current is a weekly news talk show from China to the world. We cover viral news about China every week and also give you the newest updates on China's cutting-edge technologies. Let's get started.
Welcome to China Currents, your weekly news report on what's happening in China. I'm Lisa. In this episode, China announced a new round of sanctions against 10 U.S. arms companies. Chinese airliner will operate in Southeast Asia. China beats Starlink in satellite communication tech. First, let's see the impact of China's sanctions. On the 2nd of January, China announced a new round of sanctions against 10 U.S. arms companies, including 28 subsidiaries and laboratories owned by Lockheed Martin and General Dynamics. They are banned from buying any resources from China, which is likely to seriously impact the U.S. military supply chain. According to MIT, China provides 97% of world's rare earth resources, 17 essential metals used in critical military equipment, like fighter jet engine, naval sonar systems, and tank-mounted laser rangefinders. As a result of these sanctions, repairing and restocking high-tech weapons could become much more difficult for the U.S. military, effectively making them costly disposable items. The Chinese Ministry of Commerce said these sanctions are a response to U.S. arms sales to Taiwan. Chinese strategist Professor Wang Xiangshui commented that China is giving the U.S. a taste of its own medicine. More importantly, this action reminds the U.S. that the time of unilaterally using sanctions is over. In a multipolar world, any effort to maintain a one-sided dominance are likely to fail. Recent events in Japan and Australia indicate that the U.S. plan to arm Taiwan is likely to fail, even without China's sanctions. This failure is attributed not just to operational challenges, but also fallout between the allies. On the one hand, Australia has pointed out that the U.S. is abandoning Taiwan. The main goal of supplying weapons to Taiwan is to support the First Island Chain, which is meant to contain mainland China. This strategy, designed by General MacArthur, views Taiwan as an unsinkable aircraft carrier. It dates back to 1955, when President Eisenhower stated that the U.S. would use force to protect Formosa and the Pescadores against armed attack. However, recent U.S. military actions showed a lack of confidence in meeting this commitment. The South China Morning Post reported that the U.S. Air Force is moving troops from major bases like Guam to smaller, previously unused island airstrips to avoid being targeted by Chinese missiles. Sam Roggeveen, director of the International Security Program at Australia Lowy Institute, pointed out that this change shows the U.S. military main goal in Asia is not to establish a strong presence to win a war against China, but simply to survive. The Wall Street Journal has also highlighted this retreat plan. The U.S. Air Force is reactivating an airbase on Tinian Island, which is more than 2,100 kilometers from Taipei and 2,400 kilometers from Tokyo. According to the official USAF website, the F-16 fighter jet has a maximum operational radius of less than 900 kilometers for surface attack missions. When carrying only external fuel tanks and not armed, it can reach about 3,900 kilometers. This means that if the airbase in Guam is destroyed, and even if the aircraft are saved, the USAF won't be able to provide air support to its allies. Once the US Air Force chooses to survive beyond the first island chain, it likely won't return. Additionally, on the 26th of December 2024, China revealed two sixth-generation stealth fighter jets, enhancing its military advantage in the Taiwan Strait and posing a significant challenge to the US military. This situation is unprecedented for the US Air Force since World War II, as it faces an opponent with technological capabilities that are equal or even superior to its own. So the question is, without the ability to gain an edge through superior weaponry, can the United States still challenge China's sovereignty and maintain its increasingly questionable global dominance? Japan also seems to believe that the White House strategy for Taiwan is likely to fail. Back in June 2021, Japan and the US held the largest Orient Shield mission exercise, which included an important anti-missile drill. Soon after, Japanese Deputy Prime Minister Taro Aso said that Japan and the US need to work together to defend Taiwan, as they felt that getting involved in the Taiwan situation with China was a low-risk option. However, a Chinese intercontinental missile test in September 2024 shattered this illusion. Despite prior notification from China, US radar systems stationed in Taiwan Island failed to track the missile trajectory and landing site. This failure, along with the actual combat experiences in Ukraine, prompted Japan to reassess the risk of intervening in the Taiwan situation. The US reluctance to share these risks with Japan further highlighted concerns about its reliability as an ally. Consequently, in December 2024, Japanese Prime Minister Shigeru Ishiba postponed a planned visit to the US and instead emphasized the need to improve relations with China. For US allies, it's evident that the Taiwan strategy is likely to fail, with the primary beneficiaries being arms manufacturers. Sales of arms to Taiwan have surpassed $26 billion during the Trump and Biden administrations, and these transactions seem to primarily benefit US officials. For instance, General Dynamics, which provided M1A2T tanks to Taiwan, has spent over $10 million each year on lobbying, with expenses increasing constantly since 2019. Fortunately, China's targeted sanctions on US arms companies are making arms sales to Taiwan increasingly unprofitable. This shift could allow US taxpayer funds to be redirected to more pressing needs, such as healthcare and improving outdated infrastructure. Next, here's some good news about civilian aviation. On the 2nd of January, Chinese media outlet Guancha reported that China's C919 airliner is set to operate in Southeast Asia by 2026. The C919 is entirely made in China and produced by the Commercial Aircraft Corporation of China, COMAC. As of August 2024, COMAC had received over 1,000 orders for the C919 and is actively marketing it internationally, especially in Southeast Asia. In October of the previous year, Indonesian airline Lynx Air became the first international carrier to operate a flight using another COMAC model, the C909. This was significant because it marked the first time a foreign airline used a Chinese-made plane for international flights between China and another country. Lynx Air is also considering test flights with the C919. According to forecasts from aviation consultancy Syrian, nearly 1,700 C919s could be delivered by 2042. Potentially giving it a market share of around 25%, which would challenge Boeing's 30% share. COMAC, a Shanghai-based company established just 17 years ago, has cultivated a corporate culture that prioritizes safety, making it more appealing than Boeing. The Civil Aviation Administration of China states that the C919 must undergo safety checks every 4 months or after 700 flight hours or 500 flight cycles, whichever comes first. These inspections, performed by a team of over 60 personnel, include detailed checks of the plane engines, landing gear, and cabin equipment. Boeing had the chance to develop a similar safety-focused culture, but didn't fully realize it. In March 2024, former Boeing employee John Barnett was found dead in his car. Barnett had worked in quality control at Boeing for 32 years, including 7 years as a manager at Boeing South Carolina. He had previously raised concerns about serious safety issues with the Boeing 787 Dreamliner, including the use of substandard parts. Just days before his death, he was involved in a lawsuit against Boeing. While police ruled his death a suicide by gunshot, a close friend claimed Barnett had said, "If anything happened to me, it wasn't suicide." Moving on to exciting developments in satellite technology. On the 28th of December 2024, China reached a significant milestone in satellite communication by successfully conducting its first satellite-to-ground laser communication trial at a remarkable speed of 100 gigabits per second. This breakthrough allows a satellite to transmit 10 full-length movies to Earth every second. The satellite, named O2AO2, is part of China's Yuan commercial network, developed by Changguang Satellites. This achievement positions China ahead of Elon Musk's Starlink in satellite communication capabilities. While Starlink has implemented inter-satellite laser communication, it has not yet developed a satellite-to-ground system. In contrast, China is gearing up for large-scale deployment of this technology. This advancement could soon be integrated into China's satellite ground mobile internet systems, helping to alleviate current bandwidth limitations in satellite communications. It promises faster data transfer rates and a wider spectrum, enhancing 5G non-terrestrial networks and paving the way for 6G satellite internet. Experts believe this innovation will extend network coverage to remote areas and open seas, ensuring reliable communication even in the most challenging environment. Soon, wherever there is light, there will be high-speed internet provided by China. And that is all for today. Thank you for watching this episode of China Currents. If you have any thoughts or comments about our show, please reach us at the email address below. We look forward to hearing from you and see you next time.
Thank you very kindly for the update, Lisa. Next up is Jeffrey Sachs, Director of the Center for Sustainable Development at Columbia University. Let's take his submission on the global macroeconomic scene.
Next, we have virtual speech from the speaker online. He is Jeffrey Sachs, renowned expert on global development issues, professor and director, Center for Sustainable Development at Columbia University. He's online already. Please show the video. So, Mr. Sachs, can you hear us?
I hear you very well.
Yeah, over to you.
For having me.
Over to you, Mr. Sachs. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Good morning to all of you from a dark, rainy evening in New York City. I'm very pleased to be together with you and also to have a chance to say a few words about the current global macroeconomic scene. As I think everybody appreciates, the macroeconomic scene is as unstable and as unpredictable for the moment as our geopolitical scene. We have already a world that is shaken by conflicts, that is still in a way responding to the long shadow of the COVID period and the inflation that resulted in that, that is shaken by the breaking of long-standing supply chains, especially between the United States and China, and that, of course, is also being disrupted massively by the tremendous breakthroughs in technology. And in addition, of course, we have a U.S. administration that has a lot of unpredictability in the months ahead. If President Trump is true to his word, he will lead the most protectionist administration that we've had in decades. He proclaims himself an ideological protectionist. He believes that the U.S. economy needs tariff protection. He aims to collect revenues from these tariffs. And of course, another dimension of this protectionist policy is taking aim at China and actually aiming to hinder China's economic growth by limiting the expansion of China's exports in the U.S. markets. All told, it's clear that the macroeconomic situation is unstable and to an important extent unpredictable until we see the actual policies of the incoming U.S. government and continue to see the implications of the geopolitical tensions. In that context, I want to make a few recommendations, actually. I think it is fair to say, and even with all the high unpredictability, right to forecast that China's access to the U.S. market and almost surely to the European markets as well will continue to be hindered and I think even reduced in the coming years. I think it's likely that Trump will follow through on at least some of his campaign statements regarding the rise of tariff rates vis-a-vis China, vis-a-vis Europe, and vis-a-vis even the North American partners of the United States, Canada, and Mexico. Some tariff increases are likely. It's already the case that China's exports to the U.S. market have stopped growing many years ago, and indeed significantly declined from their peaks. So there is no realistic prospect, in my view, even with negotiations ahead, of China enjoying any significant growth of exports to the U.S. market and probably more generally to the U.S. and the EU combined. And we already see the implications of this clearly as one of the major factors, and I would argue the major factor in the current relative weakness of the Chinese macroeconomy. Of course, the Chinese macroeconomy is not weak by any means. It's growing at nearly 5%. Nonetheless, the growth has come down, and there is a real puzzle as to where the growth is going to come in the future. It is important to understand the nature of the U.S. policy vis-a-vis China. I believe it to be the case that this is a policy aiming not only at protecting U.S. companies, but also at deliberately trying to stall China's growth. And for me, it has a lot of similarity to the policies that the United States followed vis-a-vis Japan towards the end of the 1980s. In that period, even though Japan was a security ally of the United States, Japan was viewed as a threat to the U.S. economy because of its great success in manufacturing growth and in the growth of Japan's exports to the United States. And starting in the mid-1980s, the U.S. took actions to stop the growth of Japan's exports. These came in a currency arrangement, the Plaza Accord, which dramatically overvalued the yen And then it came in a series of so-called voluntary export restraints, which Japan adopted, which were anything but voluntary. They were designed to commit Japan to stop the growth of exports of electronics goods, semiconductors, memory chips, and automobiles to the US market. At the end of the 1980s, Japan's growth started to stall significantly. And as Japan's growth was downrated, the asset prices in Japan plummeted. So Japan had a financial shock that was secondary to the trade restrictions. And in 1990-91, the stock market and land prices fell sharply in Japan. The bubble was burst, as it was described. And starting in 1992, Japanese growth slowed considerably over the next 20 plus years. This, in my opinion, was intentional US policy. Maybe not to hurt Japan overall, but to stop Japan's competition with the United States. And Japan's response was to keep the yen strong, and rather than trying to find other export markets, it was to increase the budget deficit and use fiscal stimulus to offset the loss of export growth. Japan ran consistently enormous budget deficits for the next 2 decades and drove up the public debt to more than 200% of GDP and the net public debt to around 150% of GDP. I mention all of this because the situation in China looks similar, to me at least, which is the US becoming protectionist, partly to protect the US market, partly to hinder China's growth, and China's growth slowing as a result. And now the public policy debate in China, what to do, with the American advice to follow the Japanese approach. Keep the renminbi strong, don't let it depreciate. Even Donald Trump is making threats that if China allows the currency to depreciate, he will retaliate, because in Trump's mind, that would be currency manipulation, and to run larger budget deficits. So the US advice is to follow Japan. Of course, I don't credit the US advice as being in China's interest. I think it is convenient advice that is not in China's own interest. So what is my own advice? My own advice is, first of all, that unlike Japan, I don't think China should accept a sharp slowdown of its export growth, albeit it should acknowledge that that export growth will not take place in the US market. So China should be very aggressively searching for exports in other markets. Hopefully, Europe will not turn as protectionist as the United States. That's one very important area for China's economic diplomacy. But I think China has tremendous export potential in the entire developing economy, which is now a substantial part of the world economy, of course. China is the low-cost competitive supplier of the infrastructure that the developing world needs. China is the low-cost provider of 5G, the low-cost provider of fast rail, the low-cost provider of fourth-generation nuclear, the low-cost provider of renewable energy, the low-cost provider of long-distance power transmission, the low-cost provider of batteries at all scales, and many, many other advanced manufactured goods. So the US says China has overcapacity. In my own view, this is, of course, wrong. China has enormous capacity that it should be exporting to the non-US, EU world economy. There is a major issue, however, which is that unlike the US and Europe, a lot of the exports to the developing world would have to be on credit, basically. And here is a second recommendation. I would recommend expanding the Belt and Road Initiative. It has come into some doubt because many countries that are in the BRI program have some measure of debt distress right now. But my view is that what China should be doing is lending more to these countries, but at longer term. So rather than BRI being financed at 10-year maturities, BRI should be financed at 20 or 30-year maturities, giving time for the borrowing countries to achieve sustained high growth rates and thereby to service the debts from the China Development Bank or from AIIB or from the New Development Bank or from other Chinese financial institutions. So my next piece of advice is longer maturities on BRI. Keep expanding exports, expand the Belt and Road Initiative, extend the maturities of the funding of the Belt and Road Initiative. My fourth piece of advice, if I might, is to allow the yen or the yuan, the renminbi, to depreciate more, not to take the US threat or to view a strong renminbi as a mark of honor. The US is protectionist. In response to US protectionism, it makes perfect sense for the renminbi to depreciate against the US dollar. It's basic economics. So I would not try to defend the yuan or the renminbi against the dollar. I would allow some depreciation. The fact that Trump threatens a kind of retaliation for that is evidence that it's the right kind of policy, in fact. It's not manipulation, it's what the market requires in the face of high protectionism. In addition to finding these new export markets, and part through extended financing of BRI, I would also recommend accelerating investments within China. So not just a consumption or budget deficit-led growth, but an accelerated investment program and public investment. Where would that be? Mainly in the energy and the digital transformation. China has a lot of energy transformation to get to a decarbonized energy system. It has all the technologies needed for that. It is important for China and the world that the energy system should be decarbonized. And I believe that China can and should lead the way. And that involves also increased rates of public investment. Yes, some of that will be deficit financed, but that's because it's not financing consumption, it's financing long-term infrastructure investment. I think two other quick points that I'd like to mention. In the context of a increasingly broken trading system, I do believe that there needs to be a true alternative to the dollar-based payments mechanism. The US, unfortunately, has not only gone protectionist, but it has weaponized the US dollar. It's done that especially, of course, vis-a-vis Russia, Venezuela, Iran, North Korea, and other countries that are deemed to be geopolitical adversaries of the United States. It's frozen their reserves, it's confiscated foreign exchange, it has blocked payments, it has thrown Russia out of the SWIFT banking system, and so forth. But China is very much affected by all of this because China's trade with its natural trading partners is also impeded, including by the threat of secondary sanctions. And for this reason, the BRICS have talked about introducing non-dollar payments. I believe that this is absolutely the right thing to do if the United States weaponizes the dollar, which unfortunately it has. My own advice to the US macro authorities repeatedly was do not confiscate other countries' reserves and do not apply unilateral or secondary sanctions. But the US wants to weaponize the currency, and then the BRICS have to respond. Of course, the renminbi will be central in that response. It's unavoidable in truth. And I believe that a digital central bank, digital currency, as already the People's Bank of China has been experimenting, can go international and can be the basis of international non-dollar payments. So I would recommend accelerating the digital central bank currency arrangements, especially among the BRICS, as a basic precaution also for China if things get really heated with the United States, which, sad to say, is not impossible. My final point is that all of these shocks hitting China, especially the geopolitical shocks and the protectionism, require a very clear macroeconomic modeling analysis. In other words, to explore the real alternative options that China faces. If China simply accepts that a slowdown means larger budget deficits to finance consumption, I think it will not be making the correct assessment of the situation. I personally would recommend continued high investment rates and continued export growth rates, but using finance as the instrument for achieving both of those goals. China is the world's high-saving economy. China's interest rates, because of that, remain very low. The prospects, therefore, to finance export growth and to finance domestic investment are strong. And that is the macro approach I would recommend, because I believe that China's continued rapid economic development is in China's interest and in the world's interest. So thank you very much for letting me share these thoughts with you today. I hope that was helpful enough, and I look forward to the chance to be together with you in person to continue this discussion at this very important time. Thank you very much.
Well, let's now listen to Keyu, who is a professor of economics at the London School of Economics and Political Science, who's speaking largely about the US trade war and whether or not it was to reduce Chinese exports to the States or mitigate China's global position in manufacturing. Please stay with us.
I think that the objectives of the US trade war, whether it was to reduce Chinese exports to the US and thereby reduce the bilateral deficit, or to mitigate China's global position in manufacturing, in that sense, that has totally failed. And I think most economists would agree that trade wars really accomplish very little except to hurt the countries involved. But I think going beyond that, there are also unexpected consequences, which is that it's really been a long march since the first trade war, where Chinese companies have already been braced for this new uncertainty. And it has set off a globalization frenzy among Chinese companies. If you look at the data, in many, many major sectors, the majority of these Chinese companies have either already considered or already implementing going global plans. And that would not have taken place as rapidly had there not been the first time trade or tariff war. Moreover, if you look at the data, Chinese exports really seamlessly flowed away from the US to other countries. And that is why currently Chinese exports are back at pre-tariff war levels, Chinese exports as a share of global exports, and have actually even climbed up. Meanwhile, the US share is declining, which means that China is even more integrated in the global economy than in the past. It's not just the US that is the only country with which it can work. It has a huge market in the developing countries. It is selling to Europe, and especially with Trump's incoming presidency, the potential to weaken the ties with the US allies in Europe means that there's an opportunity. There's an opportunity for China to embrace, to strengthen, and to reinforce these relationships and create new ones. That's what the US-China trade war has accomplished. You see, this is a new trading system, a new globalization network. The network is not static, it's dynamic. You shut off one channel, US and China, you reshuffle the other pieces, and they will realign. And we are seeing a lot of countries around the world against this background of US-China competition, signing up new trade agreements, building new trade partners, reinforcing regional trade ties, so on and so forth, as a reaction. And this is also what China is doing. There's a reshuffling, dynamic optimization, if you will, of these trading networks or financial networks and technology networks, because in the end, it is no longer just US and China in this world. It is really a global economy. I think that for all of these tactics or strategies or restrictions, there are always unintended consequences to consider. And China is not a place where they would voluntarily just submit to these aggressions, but would actually react to it. I'm not sure if we look at historical cases that either sanctions or restrictions or export controls or all kinds of barriers to another country's progress has ever worked. In fact, most of times they have backfired. Look at the Spanish blockade of Portugal. Portugal kind of built an entire navy force, in fact, thanks to the blockade, and so many other historical episodes where you cut off something and that a goal becomes of a whole of a nation program and they tend to accelerate. We're seeing some of that in China. I mean, for sure, there is a massive reaction to the technological restrictions. If you take semiconductors, China used to comfortably import them as much as they did oil in terms of value. Now, all of that demand is given to domestic companies, which are seeing more profitability, more capability, more scope to invest in research and development. And it's really just pushing them, we're forcing them to accomplish something that they didn't need to achieve before. Internal drive has never been as high in China, and you have an entire nation going after the cutting edge technology. This is coming from central to bottom, but also bottom up, where the local governments work with private sectors and entrepreneurs. And you're also forcing the private entrepreneurs, which are actually the driving force of innovation, to do more and give them more opportunities. Unlike trade and investment, where there's a lot of scope for, let's say, back and forth, tit for tat negotiations and scope for normalization to a certain extent, it is true that technological developments are going in parallel ways. Now, do I think that overall this is a good thing for US and China? Absolutely not. I mean, the world is much better where technology can be, to a certain extent, shared for the advancement of the entire global economy. But in this context, it is not as easy to just stop a very rapidly developing big nation with lots of engineers and hardworking people with big market access. It's not possible to stall it. In fact, you can spur them to achieve more. There's a great deal of irony here. When I was writing my book, the discussion was still about technology transfers that Chinese companies demand of international companies, and now the table have completely turned around. What's China's response? Well, first of all, the Chinese government's response is first, let the companies decide, right? If it's a mutual beneficial thing, they will go ahead with it. That's up to them. Shouldn't be imposed from the government top down. Look, this is economics, right? This is capitalism. You're trading one thing for another, which is trading technology for market access. I think the Chinese companies understand that very well, and they're not the first to say no to that. Because if you look at the EV sector or the batteries, Chinese companies are heavily investing in Europe. They're setting up factories, joint ventures, shifting some of the production or research centers into Europe, not into the US, by the way, but of course in Europe. And that is good for both the Chinese companies and for Europe. Europe. It is not clear what Trump, when he becomes president, would actually do with regard to imposing how much tariffs on China. I think all of that is still very much in the flux. But what I'm certain of is that China is not interested in a trade war. China is not interested in engaging more economic, financial confrontations with the United States for one reason, which is it's not going to be good for China. It's not going to be good for the US either. The majority of China's economic challenges remains within the country. It's internal, it's not external. The focus of China is not on the US. Contrary to the other way around, there's no dangerous obsession with the United States in China, unlike the dangerous obsession with China in Washington, D.C. But moreover, we've heard multiple times in the last couple of months the premier saying emphatically that China is going to be the world's opportunity, meaning China is going to open up widely, deeply, broadly, and even unilaterally if needed. China is going to impose zero tariffs on the least developing countries. That is a symbolic gesture of a big country trying to be part of a global story, trying to really kind of lift up the other countries in the network as well. Now, some people think it's a bipolar world where US and China dominate, and some other people think it's more multipolar where India plays an important role, of course, Russia, Europe, and the rising emerging markets. Whatever that is, and maybe it is not black and white, for sure, this is a shifting paradigm, both geopolitically, geoeconomically, and economically speaking. China's approach, make as many friends as possible, given the circumstances. And the competition with the US has completely strengthened that desire. And it is interesting how it's taking a very different approach from the US, with President Trump pursuing a more anti-globalist, anti-multilateralist, de-Sinicization global strategy. China is about embracing these opportunities to create more alliances and forge more partners and new trading partners and new economic collaborative possibilities around the world. And it's trying to come up with new paradigms. I do think that there is scope to create this new paradigm among developing countries because the advanced economy is so far and removed from the situation developing countries have not completely served the needs of the developing countries, whether it's the IMF or the World Bank, multilateral institutions, but also these international organizations. This global rules is written by a handful of rich countries. But the global population, global GDP, and where all the growth is coming from is no longer the center, but in the periphery, if you will. That periphery is no longer really the periphery. And so I think China being more sensitive to the needs of developing countries and some of the injustices in the international systems, not having enough voice given to developing countries can play a much more relevant role in that developing sphere. Now, does it do it perfectly? Sure, it doesn't do it perfectly. It's again a learning curve of how to also pursue strategies that really is a win-win situation for everyone. But I do believe that China is still very much embracing that win-win possibility rather than the zero-sum concept.
And that's it for this week on China Now with me, Makiza Latifa. We hope you enjoyed exploring the stories and ideas shaping today's China. Be sure to join us next Saturday morning for more insights and perspectives. Do well to also send in your comments, thoughts, feedback, and suggestions through the email provided below. Until then, stay informed, stay curious, and enjoy the rest of our programs. Thanks for watching.